You heard it right here, right now from the beach.
The new ivory is mammoth.
What do you guys want to know? I've done way too much research on dinosaurs.
Almost a larger-than-life figure.
No reason at all to think it was made by aliens.
Drop down and go swimming as fast as you can. Out of whale.
All these big giants give me a kiss and tell me they don't.
The crowd, just the pop, the loudness, the excitement, the electricity. I don't know if I can take your little Canadian destroyer.
Future is scary, but it's also wonderful. While we are near the topic of military proofs, Roman tactics always comes into the discussion. So could you tell me which strategy or innovation maybe determined or were crucial for Rome's success on the battlefield?
I mean, again, we have to remember Roman history is so long that, you know, there's lots of change. There's lots of differences depending on the period. They face different threats, different problems. They have different ambitions. I remember I wrote a book called Roman Warfare and I was asked to cover 1,000 years of Roman military history. And it was part of a series when there was something like 4 volumes on the Second World War. You know, you had war in the air, war at sea, war in the east, war in the west.
Yes.
And I got 1,000 years to cover in that time. I think the key thing...
1,000 years.
1,000 years. Yeah, exactly. Just in 40,000 words. That's fine. So it was... but the interesting thing with the Romans, and it's particularly true of the most successful periods of Roman history, is that they're very flexible and they learn from their mistakes and they adapt. And it's a striking thing of the Romans that not many cultures necessarily do, but they took great pride and they boasted that they would copy anything good that the enemy did. So, you know, they would say, well, yeah, they would learn that we learned how to fight in a phalanx from the Etruscans. We got our sword from the Spanish. We got our armor from the Gauls. You know, they'd copy things. And if the other side had it, they'd just make more of them and they'd learn how to use it. And that you see this mentality as well. We tend to think of the Romans, there's this whole idea that they're not professionals in a modern sense for most periods. Their commanders are senators. They're people who get voted into office and just get given an army in a province. And they're expected. Yeah. It's not like today where you go to a military academy and you'll be trained and, you'll go through this very rigid career structure. But they're good at learning. And they're good at listening to people who do know what they're doing, and they'll copy the other side. And whether that's locally, they always recruit, any Roman army at any period is never more than 50% Roman, even in the most, half the Roman army for this period is auxiliary. So you go to every area and you find people who are good at fighting in that particular country. They're good in the mountains, they're good in the desert, they have particular skills and knowledge, and you hire them, and you can nearly always find somebody locally who doesn't like their neighbors who's willing to fight on your side against them, because they've known them for generations and they really hate them, whereas the Romans are just new. So, again, they copy, they innovate, they have this genius for absorbing people. I mean, it's I think, unique in history. You could look at the United States of America and how they bring people from all over the world and make them American. But the Romans went out into the wider world and made them Roman. And when you think for so much of their history, you serve as an ordinary soldier in the Roman auxiliaries, and okay, you've got to serve for 25 years, so it's a big commitment, and you've got to live long enough to be discharged. But at the end of that, you become a Roman citizen with all the legal rights of anybody else, and your children are Romans. And if they want to, they can go off and join the league. And to the extent where, you have emperors come in the later periods from all over the Roman Empire, from Spain, from Syria, from North Africa, but they're Roman. Nobody is bothered by the fact of what they look like, where they've come from, because they bought into the Roman system. So, and that's, the army is one of the means of doing this, but it's that adaptability, that ability to absorb others, both temporarily when you need them to fight, but also in the longer term. And the other striking thing, the Romans, they don't give up easily. So they fight these wars where they take appalling casualties, say when they're fighting Hannibal and the Carthaginians.
Oh.
In 3 years, 1/3 of Rome's Senate is killed. And, a large chunk, about 100,000 of your adult male Roman and Latin allies are dead in just that time. It's a huge chunk of your population. There aren't many societies that could take those sorts of losses and not say, okay, let's negotiate, let's just give in. Because that's all Hannibal wanted. He just wants to dictate terms to them. He's not trying to destroy them. but they, for much of their history, they see everything as a sort of a battle for survival, and they just don't quit, and they keep coming back at you. And because they learn, and they might start the war doing badly, but they learn from the enemy, and by the end, they're usually as good as the enemy's been. And later on, obviously, when they've got a more professional army, they're usually better than everybody to start off with. So they have all these advantages, and they just, it's maybe perhaps, I mean, it's not something you'd want in a modern democracy, but because their political leadership always provides their military leadership as well, they usually have a very clear idea of what they want from a war. So it's not just let's go off and fight, and then maybe we'll fight them again in 10 years' time, or we'll just get a bit of glory, a bit of money, and go home. They think in more permanent, long-term ideas. There's an interesting quote from a historian writing in the Roman period who talks about Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, and very sort of, he obviously doesn't see this as admirable, but he says Philip made war like a merchant. He basically invested money in an army, won a victory, and then took the profits from that victory to invest in his army for the next war and the next war, and he keeps on. And you think the Romans are a bit like that. They almost think in this business-like way of it's sustainable, rather than war simply being part of society to prove that your kings and your chieftains are brave and are glorious and all this sort of thing. There's a purpose to it. So I think that gives them a big advantage. They're just thinking in a different way to nearly everybody else out there.
You mentioned Hannibal and the Punic Wars, and I have here a quote on Latin, which will I try to pronounce from Cato. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delandam, or by the way, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. Romans were obsessed with Carthage more than any other state. They were fighting with maybe Persians or something. So, and you mentioned the Battle of Cannae, right? And how do you see this conflict between Carthage, Hannibal, and between Roman? Because, as you said, Hannibal didn't want to destroy them; he wanted to negotiate, and in the end, Carthage got destroyed. And that would be a great movie, the fall of Carthage, the final third Punic.
Yes. There's so much. You look at history and you keep thinking, I'd love to see that on screen. You could, backdrop for a story and just to try and do it. They might get lots of things wrong, but it's like, the Oliver Stone Alexander movie. There's lots of it that's just a bit strange, but there are a few scenes that are just, you think, yeah, that's close to right. That really looks close to how I imagine it anyway. Like the Battle of Gaugamela they do there is very well done. It's the Punic Wars. I mean, it's an interesting struggle because, again, we forget that when the first war starts, the Romans are just a power in Italy. They're not the empire they're going to become. And we know they're going to do that. And we know they're going to be around for a long time, but they just seem another Italian state. They've grown. But even that first Punic War, the one that's fought mainly around Sicily, because it's not so well described in such detail by our sources, we forget the losses the Romans suffer mainly through their fleets being wrecked at sea. They build warships, they're good at fighting them, they're just not very good at sailing them. And they don't really understand the power of the weather. But they suffer, tens of thousands of loss of dead year after year, and yet they keep going. And they keep on building another fleet and another fleet. They then treat the Carthaginians. It's one of the problems. They don't quite know how to treat the Carthaginians. Because if they were an enemy they defeated in Italy, they could just absorb them. But Carthage is too big for that, and it's too far away. So they treat Carthage very much as an inferior after that war. And that's clearly the cause of this second war, is that people like Hannibal and his father resent the Romans pushing them around. The Romans sort of seize Corsica and Sardinia because they can from the Carthaginians, and basically say, well, if you don't like it, fight us. And they know the Carthaginians aren't at that stage in a position to fight them. But the thing Hannibal does is really scare the Romans. They are terrified. And if you think Alexander the Great can conquer the Persian Empire in 3 big battles, some sieges, Hannibal inflicts worse losses on the Romans, and they won't quit. They will not give in. And, the commander who's blamed, Varro, at least gets blamed in the sources for the defeat at Cannae, when 50,000 Romans and allies are killed in a day, and another, nearly 20,000 captured. out of your entire adult male population eligible for military service is about 700,000 when the war starts. And you've already lost badly in some of the earlier battles. So this is, these are really significant losses. And as I say, 1/3 of Rome's Senate, 100 out of 300, more than 100 are dead. People you knew, people who are making the decisions, people you sit next to at meetings of the Senate. So you would think most normal states would at this point negotiate and say, okay, because, peace in the ancient world, they have this tendency to declare, the Greeks are very fond of this, they'll sign a peace treaty and declare 20 years peace between us, or even 100 years peace. And whatever happens, they never have that period of peace. Either they start the war most often before, or very occasionally the peace treaty lasts a bit longer. But the number that's on the paper, on that document, bears no relation at all to what will actually happen. But that's how ancient states operate. Yes, you lose some prestige, you lose some money, but the Romans just won't accept that. And another big difference, if you look at any, when the Persians come to invade Greece in 490 BC or 480 BC, there are exiles from Athens, from Sparta, with the Persian army and advising the Persian king. There's never a Roman serving with the Carthaginians. If you can't be politically successful at Rome, then it's not worth being successful anyway. You live and die with the Republic. So they do identify very strongly. And given that, you can look, these Romans are not by this time ethnically all Roman, all Latin. They're a mixed bag of Italians, but they feel that they belong to this republic, this state, and they'll fight and they'll die for it. And they will just keep going. And in the end, they wear Hannibal down. And that's that fear that just over 50 years later, that Cato will represent. Carthage nearly destroyed us. That's the memory. We were on the brink of, that was it. The Republic would be gone. Rome would be gone forever. If we let them grow prosperous again, they could do it. They could come back. So that's, they move to destroy, and the Romans make it harder for themselves than they should, because their army isn't as efficient by this time. So it takes them 3 years to win a war against, it's very one-sided in other respects. But even so, they've got to do it. And Carthage as a political entity is gone. It is simply, it will not be there. It will return as a Roman colony a little bit later. But that's the Carthage that then emerges is very much Roman. So I think that contributes to this Roman sense of, every war is a battle to the death, because the Second Punic War, the struggle with Hannibal, really did feel like it to them. You can sense that and just you look at the losses, you look at the devastation, you can understand how, again, we know that they will keep going and they will win, but they didn't at the time. So, it's clearly a traumatic event that has long-term repercussions in Roman society, the Roman economy, all of these things, but also their mentality. You do feel that they're scared and they react like a lot of frightened people. They really want to take that threat out forever.
Yeah, so they wipe them off the planet.
Yeah, as you do.
That's what we do.
It's humor.
Yeah.
I love how in some odd sense history works, life works, because if we follow the legend, if Troy never fell, Romulus and Rem's ancestor would never come to Rome, to Italy, and we would never have maybe Rome built. But speaking about great people, let's speak about Julius Caesar. We haven't mentioned him yet. It's hard to pinpoint what moment of his life defined Julius Caesar, right? But certainly one of pivotal moments was the crossing of the Rubicon. So how did you perceive Caesar in this point of no return? How do you understand his never-ending ambitions? What would Caesar say?
It's the marvelous thing about that period is that to a great extent, because of the orator Cicero, because of his letters, we have so much more information of what was happening, but also what people were saying, all the rumors, the false reports, because a couple of months before this, in the previous year, the story went round Rome that Julius Caesar had marched into Italy, and one of the consuls of the year takes a sword to Pompey and tells him to defend the Republic without actually saying by name against Julius Caesar, but everybody knows that. And then a few days later, they're all embarrassed because they realize actually he's still in his province, hasn't done anything. So there isn't the civil war that we thought was going to. You get that sense that the frustrating bit is that in antiquity, a collection of letters written by Julius Caesar to Cicero and by Cicero back to Caesar survived. And only a handful of them have led, same as there were also letters to Augustus and a collection to Pompey that haven't been preserved. So there are aspects we don't know because Cicero, by this time, is outside Rome. He's come back from Cilicia, southern Turkey today, and he's hoping to get a triumph for a very minor campaign on the border with Syria. So he's got a few troops, which means he's got the embarrassment of he has military authority at that time, and there's this civil war breaking out, so he can't really stay out of it. But he doesn't know what's going on. He's trying to learn it. This is a guess. And again, we're going to come back to what we said earlier. You've got to be very clear when you're saying that. But I suspect each side thought that the other one would back down, that they could threaten. It was one of those cases where they think surely they won't fight over this because essentially there is no ideological difference between Julius Caesar and the senators who oppose him. And again, modern scholars will often say Julius Caesar fights the Senate. That's not true. The majority of the Senate just doesn't want to fight anybody. You know, they don't want to get killed. They don't want to pick the wrong side, and they don't want a civil war. Who would? You know, you don't want your estate devastated by the armies coming through. So it's a group of senators who don't like Julius Caesar or think that he's finished or think this is going to be the winning side are bitterly opposed to him. And they wish to end his career, or at the very least make him dependent on Pompey, so he's going to take a big blow to his prestige. Julius Caesar, on the other hand, is willing to fight a civil war and plunge the world into chaos to protect his reputation and his status. And, you know, while you can see his point of view on the basis that he's been legally voted all these offices, all these commands in Gaul, he's been given he has had more days of public thanksgiving voted to him by the Senate and the people of Rome in the last 10 years than any Roman general up until this point, including Pompey. So until just recently, everyone's been saying, great, marvelous, look what you're doing, isn't this wonderful? Yeah, we never liked the Gauls anyway, they're our traditional enemy, well done, you know, this sort of thing. And suddenly they turn on him and say, oh no, you can't have this and you can't have that. So I think neither side can quite believe that the other one will fight. They think in the end they can threaten and posture. And it's interesting that Caesar, you know, yes, on the one hand, crossing the Rubicon is that moment where from that point on, you could say that he isn't legally allowed to command the soldiers he commands. He hasn't been told by the Senate to come back for this reason. So he is, from that point on, he's a rebel. You know, he is challenging the state. But he keeps on asking, if you follow day by day what happens in those next few months, he keeps on saying he wants to talk, he wants to negotiate, he wants to do a deal, he wants to talk. Can he meet Pompey face to face? You know, can we just sort this out? And Pompey's allies won't let Pompey meet him because they don't trust Pompey. And the problem is Julius Caesar, one thing that does come through from all the sources is he clearly had a lot of charm. You know, he was very persuasive in the way that you get it with some modern politicians, even some that, you know, sometimes people will tell you if you're in the room with this man or this woman, you just find yourself agreeing with them, even if you don't agree with any of their politics. But there's just something about their person. Yes, I've heard, you know, at least two people I've met who are very polar opposites to him politically, went to meet him and ended up donating money to his campaign and walked out of that room not knowing why. And they just couldn't understand it to this day, but they just thought, he's good. There is something. And I don't think that really came across on TV, say. I mean, maybe it's the difference between I'm British, you know, the style of American politics is very different to what we have over here. But Caesar clearly had that. And so I think people didn't trust him. And the people who come to hate him really hate him because they see other people won over by this charm. And that sort of annoys them all before. And someone like Cato, you know, clearly lacks charm. He doesn't have it. He's got a big personality, but it's not charm. He's not, people don't like him. They respect him. They're frightened of him, but they don't like him so much. It seems that they liked, you know, and again, there's one of the problems is, you get the sources suggesting this whole soap opera element of Roman politics where, you know, Caesar is having this affair with Cato's half-sister, the mother of Brutus. So all of this is going on in the background. And so yes, there's a lot of reasons for you not to like this guy. But in the end, you feel this civil war is pointless. And there is something frustrating when you're writing about it, because you really think if these people could have just sat down and talked it through, what would have been so terrible if Julius Caesar had come back and had a second consulship and then maybe gone on to another province? I don't think that really was the end of the Roman world or the monarchy that would in fact come. But again, people at the time clearly didn't believe that. They thought this person is a real threat to us. And it's so you feel there's a lot of misunderstanding. But I think some of it comes back to this Roman tradition we were talking about when we were talking about warfare, of not giving in. And it's one of the reasons Roman civil wars are so bitter, is that all of your sort of your upbringing as an aristocrat is all about you keep fighting and you just keep fighting and you never quit and you'll win in the end. And when you've got two groups of people who've been brought up the same way, who both think that way, then your civil wars are going to be bad because nobody's going to give in and you can't really negotiate. And Roman civil wars don't end with negotiation. You have the sort of temporary truces between Mark Antony and Octavian Augustus, call him what you will at that stage, and Lepidus, but it doesn't last. And most of them you fight to the death. And Caesar is the oddity in that he doesn't kill his opponents. He keeps boasting of his clemency, his clementia, and saying, it's a new way of victory. And he captures people, lets them go, and then they fight him again. And sometimes he lets them go a second time before he kills them the third time. And of course, later, Antony and Octavian will say, well, Caesar pardoned all these people like Brutus and Cassius, and look what they did to him. So we're not going to make the same mistake. So
Augustus, right, he formed his personal guard, like his guardship, because of what happened to Caesar.
Yes, exactly. And they state when they post the prescription list, these death lists of people who lose all legal rights and anybody can kill them and claim a reward if you bring their head to the authorities. They say quite expressly, this is because Caesar pardoned people and they rewarded his kindness with hatred and they murdered him. So, we are not going to take that chance. Sorry, but that's it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's it has an ancient, obviously, spark to it. But on that note, obviously, it was a lot about politics and people wanting to negotiate, not negotiate, and it feels like you said a lot of these conflicts could, if people just sat down and dealt with it. It strongly reminds of even today. Like if people could just sit down and talk. It feels like solutions would come on.
Although sometimes, as we all know, occasionally from family meetings where things go wrong, you can all sit around the table and be yelling at each other quite quickly as well. So it doesn't always work. But then human history shows that again and again, people fight over things that with hindsight you think, was it really worth it? It's quite striking, again, right, looking at the wars between the Romans and the Persians in the sort of 6th century AD, and in particular Justinian and that era. Often one side will start a war because they've got a short-term advantage and they think, I can get some glory, I can get some loot and some money from the other side and have a treaty whereby it'll make clear that I'm bigger and more important than they are. And they keep rolling the dice one more time because they do quite well early on when the enemy is weak. But then they think, I can gain a bit more. I can get a stronger bargaining position. And they push it to the point where they actually don't gain very much. And they've spent far more because these wars get more and more costly, more and more difficult. So they end up grudgingly negotiating and settling on a peace treaty. But what's very interesting about those wars between the two empires is that all the way through, every year they're sending embassies to each other. So the warfare is always this quite restrained, okay, we'll fight for a bit, but let's talk about it. I'm just, you can see I'm stronger than you at the moment, so give me a good deal and we can be friends again. It's that sort of, and the problem is each one thinks they can get a better bargaining position, a better hand of cards. So they keep risky and it goes on, even when, in fact, they are negotiating very, very frequently.
Yeah. I mean, I have, obviously, we now mentioned Senate, and I don't want to forget to ask you this. Obviously, there is a story in 509 BC, there was overthrow of monarchy and creation of Senate. But I've read that story is disputed, as there's a lot of myth to it. How do you think? What's your take on creation of the Roman Republic?
Well, it clearly happened around about that time. Something happened at that stage where the Rome became a different system, and from then on, they're naming the years by the two consuls. The Romans don't start writing history down until after they've defeated Hannibal. So that's 300 years later, just slightly over before. So how much do you remember? People have passed down, there are songs within the noble families celebrating their deeds. There are traditions, there are stories. You do wonder how much the Romans really knew about what had happened that long ago. You suspect it's a mixture. Some of those traditions, some of those what are now seem like myths, probably have a basis of some truth in them. And people like the ones, but they've been added to. On the other hand, the Greek historian Polybius, who's in Rome in the 2nd century BC, claimed to have seen a treaty made with Carthage within a few years of the Republic being founded, and that there was still the documents. So the Romans do keep some records, even from early on, and they keep lots of records about property. And some of their laws, it's not quite clear when those are written down. Bear in mind, 509, it's the same sort of time that the Athenians are, with Cleisthenes, are creating their democratic form of government. So, we sometimes, because we don't know so much about the Romans and the sources are different, we forget what's going on in the wider world. There seems to be a move at that time in Greece, in a lot of the islands, and in Italy, away from monarchies towards elected officials in your system, a sort of aristocratic form of government. How it then develops into the Roman Republic that we can start to understand and study, which really isn't till the 2nd century BC and to some extent the 1st, and how many of the traditions of, when the patricians and plebeians argue with each other, when the tribunes of the plebs are created, the plebs go on strike, all these sorts of disputes, things like that probably happen, but whether they quite happen in the way the stories are preserved, you suspect, again, it's a mixture. Some of it's probably near enough right, and then some of it's just romantic embellishment.
Yes. But I wanted to ask you also on that note that this is maybe a little bit newer, but big part of the Roman history is obviously its relationship to the religion and particularly later Christianity. And, we for example, we view Marcus Aurelius, obviously in present time, as this a man who solved the universe, and we tend to see him as a good guy, but in Christian history, he wouldn't be viewed so favorably. How much do you think that Christianity and that transition from ancient Roman religion to that actually influenced empire? Do you think that it had to deal with its fall and how later Eastern Empire was unraveled and things like that? How do you think? How much of its role do you think is important in its history?
It's hard to say, because obviously the sort of gradual spread of Christianity to the point where under Constantine it becomes the sort of main religion of the empire. That's happening over a long period of time when other changes in society were happening as well. So which is the critical thing? One striking thing is that in terms of its ideology of empire, it doesn't really change anything much at all. The Romans before had considered themselves favored by the gods, beloved of the gods. And, the sheer fact that you end up with a pope who's Pontifex Maximus, you take on the title of priesthood that Julius Caesar had. Because the organization adds to it, it builds on, but it's because it's developing at a time when the Roman Empire has become more and more bureaucratic, less efficient. It takes on, the church sort of structures itself around that. I think it's probably less of a change. It's than we sometimes make out. I think, again, the civil wars have been happening for a long time before then, and with the possible exception of one in the late 4th century AD, none of them are between formerly Christians and pagans, say. Again, these are civil wars just about power. There's not ideology in it at all. It's about who's going to be emperor. And that's already happening. I suspect one of the problems is that sometimes scholars will come and because we know what Christianity means, we look at the Roman Empire and we try and estimate the number of Christians, and we take a sort of theological standpoint, and we say, well, unless you believe exclusively in this, there's only one God, Jesus is his son, this is how you get salvation, then you're not properly a Christian. But that's thinking in a modern monotheistic way. If you're coming from the polytheistic tradition of the ancient world, what I suspect happened is that there were quite a lot of people who listened to what the Christians were saying and thought, yeah, that's okay, and just added Jesus or the Hebrew God, however you call it, to the gods they revered already. There's even a story, it's from the Historia Augusta, so it's not that reliable, that the Severus Alexander had amongst his sort of household gods, the ones he'd worship, he had a little statue of Jesus. Now, what that looked like, how did you depict? But I remember talking to someone who was a Christian minister who was working in India, and he said, well, when you talk to people, they're very often quite happy to say, from the Hindu point of view, yes, fine, we can just fit Jesus in. It doesn't mean you stop doing, because again, you've got lots of gods. So I suspect people sometimes say, Constantine, he's appealing to this minority religion. I suspect by that time, actually, this is a pretty large number of people that are, some of them are what we would consider Christians, but some of them are sympathetic to Christians, or sort of might see themselves as Christian, but also as other things as well. And that might explain the development, the reverence for saints and the association, in the same way you'll light a candle to a saint if you're going on a journey, and this sort of thing develops on from traditions you've always had, and you merge. So I don't think it really weakened the Roman Empire. And you can see, obviously, later on, a lot of money is invested in churches, in monasteries, in these foundations. But actually, that's not that different from building temples, building basilicas and things you've done in the past. Somebody's still got to provide the materials you use, which means somebody's making money out of that. You've got the labor force. So like a lot of the big monuments we see in the ancient world, we see the Grand Temple, we see the aqueduct. Aqueduct has a practical purpose. Bathhouse is to make your life comfortable. Temple is about status, it's about reverence for the gods. But they only get there because somebody spent a lot of money, and it's created jobs and work and employment for a lot of people. So, sometimes you see these things, they're a drain. Well, actually, they're not, because if you keep building these things, somebody's got to do that work. And even if it's a donation, the city magistrates or the emperor is saying, I am paying for this, somebody is still paying for this. So it's still an important part of the empire. I think there are other reasons. It's as I say, there are so many other changes going on in society of which this is part, that I suspect it isn't something that weakens, because the Roman army does not fight any differently because it's become Christian. Constantine's men might paint the Cairo on their shields, but you will still, if you capture a city, you'll enslave the population or you'll massacre them. They're just as ruthless. So it doesn't change the way you do things. The emperor still has, the emperor comes just to see himself as sort of God's representative on earth, in the same way that you'd been there for, you're the senior magistrate of the Republic, but you're still there to represent good law, good rule, stability, all of these things.
And execute your own son, but
sometimes, yeah, exactly. Not a time for very happy families or getting on with it.
Yeah. Well, we are on a time limit here again, and I would love to chat about maybe Constantine and how I think that he was actually a bit more pragmatic than we think, objectively looking to it now, and that was part of his political agenda. But let's go in with our little tradition on this podcast, where we, at the end of every episode, we say a quote from one of our people in our language and translate it to English. And I've chosen a quote from a writer named Miloš Crnjanski, and he said on our language, cijela zemlja izgrađena je na prošlosti. Daleko je od mene i sama pomisao da bi na toj prošlosti trebalo stati daleko od toga. And translated to English, it would be, the whole country is built on the past. The very thought that we should stop at that past is far from me, far from it. Yeah. That's his quote. I hope...
Very sense. Right.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as we did.
Yep. No, as you've noticed, I like talking about the Romans. So it's always fun.
And as you notice, we love hearing about, listening about Romans. So that, long live the empire. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
We stay genuine, uncensored, and unscripted, and we always will, as we have to order our usual. Share us, subscribe us, and stay tuned until the next Wednesday. IKUZO!